That thing belongs in a scrapyard, not on a farm. Laughter that followed was loud enough for everyone in the auction yard to hear. 17-year-old Ethan Carter stood beside his father's battered red tractor, his hands covered in grease, his worn denim shirt soaked through with sweat. He didn't look at the men laughing. He kept staring at the open engine compartment. Because Ethan knew something they didn't. The tractor wasn't dead. It was waiting for someone patient enough to understand it. Across the auction yard, a wealthy farmer named Thomas Hayes watched Ethan work. He had seen hundreds of tractors in his lifetime. But there was something about this one that made him stop. Thomas slowly walked closer. Then he noticed the serial plate. His expression changed, because he recognized the tractor. And what he discovered next would change the Carter family's life forever. The auction yard sat on the edge of a small farming town in Kansas. It was a cold morning in March. The fields surrounding the town were still brown from winter, but farmers were already preparing for planting season. For Ethan Carter, there was no room for failure. His family's 80-acre farm had been struggling for years. His father, Daniel, had died 3 years earlier after a long illness. Since then, Ethan and his mother, Sarah, had done everything they could to keep the farm alive. They had sold their cattle. They had stopped repairing anything they could live without. They had even turned off the old farmhouse heater during the coldest nights to save money. But the tractor was the one thing they could not afford to lose. It had belonged to Ethan's father. A faded red 1970s model with cracked tires, peeling paint, one missing headlight, and an engine that hadn't run properly in almost 2 years. Ethan had spent every spare hour trying to bring it back to life. Because without that tractor, they couldn't plant the spring crop. And without the spring crop, they would lose the farm. Ethan tightened the last bolt and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. He climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The engine coughed. Once, twice, then silence. A group of farmers standing nearby burst into laughter. Victor Reed, the owner of the largest farm equipment dealership in the county, shook his head. "Son," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you've been working on that thing all morning." Ethan climbed down. Victor pointed at the tractor. "That machine hasn't been useful since your father was alive." More laughter. Ethan looked down. Victor smiled. "You know what I'd do if I were you?" Ethan said nothing. "I'd stop wasting your time and sell it for scrap." A few men nodded. One of them laughed. "Probably worth more as scrap metal." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. His mother had taught him something after his father died. Never let someone else's cruelty decide who you become. So Ethan picked up his wrench again and went back to work. What he didn't know was that someone important had been watching the entire time. Thomas Hayes stood near the auction office. He was 60 years old. He owned one of the largest cattle ranches in the state. His ranch stretched across thousands of acres. He had hundreds of cattle, dozens of employees, and enough money to buy every tractor in the auction yard without checking the price. But Thomas rarely looked wealthy. He wore an old brown jacket, dusty boots, and a weathered cowboy hat. Most people knew him as a hard-working rancher. Few knew just how much land and money he controlled. Thomas watched Ethan for another few seconds. Then he walked toward the tractor. He didn't look at Ethan. He looked at the engine. "Who taught you to work on one of these?" Ethan looked up. "My father." Thomas nodded. "What did he tell you about this engine?" Ethan hesitated. He said if it cranks, there's still hope. For the first time that morning, Thomas smiled. "Your father was right." Ethan looked surprised. "You knew my dad?" Thomas's expression became serious. "Daniel Carter?" Ethan nodded. Thomas looked at the tractor again. "I knew him." Before Ethan could ask another question, Victor Reed stepped between them. "Thomas, don't encourage the boy." Victor laughed. "That tractor is finished." Thomas slowly turned toward him. "Are you sure?" Victor frowned. "I've been selling farm equipment for 30 years. Thomas looked back at Ethan. "Then you should know better than anyone that a machine can look finished without actually being finished." Victor didn't like the answer. Thomas pointed toward the tractor. Start it again. Ethan turned the key. The engine coughed. Thomas listened. His eyes narrowed. Again. Ethan tried. Nothing. Thomas walked around the tractor. He crouched beside the engine. Then he saw something. A small metal plate beneath a layer of grease. Thomas wiped it with his finger. The serial number became visible. He froze. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he stood. Where did your father get this tractor? Ethan shrugged. I think he bought it used when I was little. Thomas looked at him. No. His voice was quiet. He didn't. That afternoon, Ethan returned home without fixing the tractor. His mother was waiting on the porch. She could tell from his face that something had happened. What is it? Ethan told her about Thomas Hayes. When he mentioned that Thomas knew his father, Sarah became unusually quiet. You never told me Dad knew him. His mother looked toward the fields. There are things about your father's last few years I never wanted you to worry about. Ethan frowned. What things? Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she asked, Did Mr. Hayes say anything about the tractor? Ethan shook his head. He just recognized the serial number. Sarah's face went pale. Then, she whispered, your father told me never to let anyone take that tractor. Ethan stared at her. Why? His mother looked at the old machine sitting behind the barn. I don't know. But she did. At least, she knew part of the truth. And she had been afraid of it for 3 years. The next morning, Thomas Hayes arrived at the Carter farm. He didn't come alone. He brought an old leather briefcase. Ethan met him beside the barn. Thomas looked at the tractor. Then he opened the briefcase. Inside was an old photograph. Ethan took it. His father stood beside the same tractor, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a much younger Thomas Hayes. Ethan looked up. When was this? 21 years ago. What were you doing? Thomas looked toward the fields. Your father had discovered something. What? Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, Has anyone offered to buy your farm recently? Ethan's face changed. Victor Reed. Thomas nodded. How much? More than the farm is worth. Thomas looked at him. That should concern you. Why? Because nobody pays more than something is worth unless they know something you don't. Ethan felt a chill despite the morning sun. Thomas opened the briefcase again. He removed a stack of documents. These are county development maps. He spread them across the hood of the tractor. A proposed irrigation project was marked in red. A new agricultural processing facility was planned less than 10 miles away. Then Ethan noticed something. The proposed water line crossed directly through their property. Thomas pointed to a blue line beneath the farm. Your family owns the water rights to this underground channel. Ethan stared at him. I didn't know that. Neither did most people. Thomas looked toward the farmhouse. Your father did. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He went into the barn. The tractor sat beneath a dusty tarp. He remembered his father's voice. If it cranks, there's still hope. Ethan began looking through the old toolbox attached to the tractor. He found spark plugs, bolts, a rusted screwdriver, an old rag. Then his fingers touched something beneath the bottom panel. A folded piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was yellow with age. His father's handwriting covered the front. Ethan unfolded it. There were only 6 words. Check the old irrigation well. Ethan's heart began pounding. He ran to find Thomas. The old irrigation well was nearly half a mile behind the farmhouse. It hadn't been used in decades. Ethan and Thomas reached it just before sunrise. Thomas removed the rusted cover. Below them was darkness. They climbed down. 20 feet below ground, they found an old concrete passage. The tunnel stretched beneath the farm. Thomas held his flashlight against the wall. Then he saw something. A series of markings. Survey numbers, dates, and initials. Thomas recognized them immediately. Your father wasn't imagining anything. Ethan looked at him. What happened? Thomas took a breath. Your father discovered that someone was illegally redirecting water from this channel. Who? Thomas looked at the markings. The same people trying to buy your farm. Suddenly, everything made sense. The low purchase offers, the bank pressure, the strange surveyors Ethan had seen near the property, the urgency to get the family off the land. It wasn't about 80 acres. It was about the water beneath them. 3 days later, Victor Reed arrived at the Carter farmhouse with 2 men from the bank. He carried a folder. "I've been patient," Victor said. Sarah stepped onto the porch. "We told you we're not selling." Victor smiled. "You don't have much choice anymore." He handed her the papers. "Your loan is overdue." Ethan stepped forward. "That isn't right." Victor looked at him. "Then perhaps you should fix your tractor instead of pretending you're a farmer." The men laughed. Ethan's face burned. Then a deep voice came from behind them. "That's enough." Everyone turned. Thomas Hayes stood at the edge of the driveway. He was holding a folder of his own. Victor's smile disappeared. Thomas walked toward them. "You've been trying to buy this farm for 8 months." Victor said nothing. "You increased the interest." Silence. "You sent surveyors onto private property." Still silence. "And you knew about the water rights." Victor's face hardened. "You have no proof." Thomas lifted the old note Ethan had found inside the tractor. "Your proof is in your own handwriting." Victor stared at it. Then he looked at Ethan. "How did you get that?" Thomas smiled. "You made one mistake." Victor said nothing. "You laughed at the tractor." Thomas held up the paper. "And that tractor carried the evidence you spent 3 years trying to destroy." The county investigation began 2 weeks later. Bank records were examined. Survey documents were uncovered. Illegal water agreements were found. Victor Reed lost his dealership. The bank was forced to cancel the fraudulent penalties against the Carter farm, and the Carter property was officially recognized as one of the most important water access farms in the county. But Thomas Hayes didn't buy the land. He didn't give Ethan's family charity. Instead, he offered Ethan something different: a job. "Come work for me," Thomas said. "Learn everything you can about engines, cattle, irrigation, and farming." Ethan looked at his mother, then at the old tractor. "I want to save our farm." Thomas smiled. "Then learn how to make it stronger." 6 months later, the fields around the Carter farm were green. The farmhouse had been repaired. The roof no longer leaked, and the old tractor stood in the center of the field. But it didn't look broken anymore. Ethan had restored it. Every bolt, every hose, every piece of faded metal. The missing headlight had been replaced. The tires were new. The engine had been rebuilt. And on a bright autumn morning, Ethan climbed into the driver's seat.
"You did it, son."
Yeah.
His mother stood beside the fence. Thomas Hayes watched from his
Looking
horse.
good, Ethan.
Ethan turned the key. The engine came alive. A deep mechanical roar rolled across the
It
field.
works.
The same tractor that everyone had laughed at
Why were
months
they
earlier
laughing?
was pulling a new plow
Because
through the
they couldn't
soil.
see what you saw.
Ethan smiled.
What did I see?
Thomas rode closer.
Possibility.
"You know," Thomas said,
You think it's
"they
enough?
weren't laughing because that
It's
tractor
all
was
we've got.
worthless."
Let's go.
Ethan
Be
looked at
safe
him.
out there.
"Why were they laughing?" Thomas glanced toward the farm. "Because they couldn't see what you saw." Ethan smiled. "What did I see?" Thomas looked at the tractor. Possibility. The tractor disappeared into the golden field. And from that day forward, nobody in that town called it worthless again. Because sometimes, the thing everyone else is laughing at is the very thing that can save everything you have left.